Meneka lay back once again in the command couch at Benji's heart. She was aware that her pulse was hammering harder than it ought to have been, and although her mouth seemed unaccountably dry, she found herself swallowing again and again. Jitters, she told herself. And no wonder. I guess I'd have to be a Bolo myself not to feel them, but God, I'm scared. Benji? Yes, Meneka. Benji, I'm terrified out of my wits, she confessed miserably. No, you're not, he told her calmly. The visual display showed the blurry, featureless gray of hyperspace. All of his optical heads could pick up as he rode the assault pod locked into the exterior of the Sleipner-class transport Tannenberg. Over half his entire hull protruded beyond the pod's skin, exposing his onboard sensors and his weapons, and Captain Anton Harris and Unit 28D-431 ALN rode the pod hardpoint on the far side of Tannenberg's hull. Between them, Benji and Alan provided the otherwise unarmed transport, with the equivalent of a battlecruiser's energy weapons firepower, and an anti-missile capability at least as good as a light cruiser's. What they could not provide was the standoff attack range of a standard ship-to-ship missile. Their weapons simply weren't designed for that sort of environment. Meneka and Benji shared their pod with Company C, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Regiment, 9th Marine Division. Captain Bolestenik, Charlie Company's CO, had introduced herself to them when her company embarked, and she and Meneka had spent several hours discussing possible scenarios once they hit the surface of Chartres. Assuming any of us gets to the surface, she thought grimly, acutely conscious of the flutter of her pulse. Oh yes, I am terrified, she told her Bolo. You are frightened, Benji agreed. This is normal and indeed healthy reaction to the prospect of battle and possible death. But your fear is far from paralyzing you or preventing you from thinking clearly, nor is fear a bad thing for you to experience. Bolos do not experience that particular emotion in the same fashion as humans, Meneka, or so I believe. It has been said that with reason that our personalities are more bloodthirsty than those of most humans. As a result, we feel much of the anticipation as anxiety at a moment like this. It is quite literally what we are designed and built to do, our highest function. But do not think we are strangers to fear. We fear that we will fail in our mission. We fear we will prove unequal to the challenge we face. And just as our internal diagnostic systems have been programmed to feel the equivalent of pain when we take damage, our personalities include a fierce desire to survive. It has been some time since the Concordiat made the error of believing that a warrior who embraces death without fear is the ideal. Fear is as much a tool as courage, Meneka. As too much courage becomes suicidal recklessness, too much fear can become paralyzing panic. But to achieve the most effective level of combat, any warrior, human or Bolo, must properly balance the cautionary impact of fear with the aggressiveness engendered by courage. This, I believe, you have done. You have a better opinion of me than I do, Meneka said. Because you perceive all of your faults from within, Benji said serenely. I, however, am able to observe your responses and actions from without. You would not have been able to coordinate so well with Captain Bolestenik had you been terrified out of your wits. Maybe, Meneka conceded dubiously. Actually, she thought for all the time she and Bolestenik had spent discussing possible tactical situations and the responses to them, there hadn't been really a great deal of planning they could do. Either they got to the surface of the planet alive, or they didn't. If they did, Bolestenik's Marines would disembark on their own light armored vehicles and form up to follow her and Benji as the 39th Battalion advanced against the enemy. And after that, everything would depend on what happened next. The 9th Marines were a potent fighting force, at least the equal of any Melkonian army division, and arguably superior of the two of them in actual combat power. But neither the personal armor nor their vehicles had the firepower and toughness to stand up to Melkonian combat mechs. If the 39th could get through the perimeter of the Melkonian LZ, the 9th would undoubtedly prove its worth, but getting through that perimeter in the first place was going to be supremely difficult. Captain Jeski informs me that we'll be dropping out of hyper in approximately 12 minutes, Benji informed her suddenly, and she twitched in her command couch. That approximately 12 minutes had to have come directly from Jeski, Tannenberg's merely human commander. No Bolo would have been guilty of such imprecision. The thought made her giggle unexpectedly, and she blinked as she realized her unanticipated amusement was entirely genuine. Maybe I'm not such a hopeless basket case after all, she thought. Understood. Please make sure Captain Bolos also has that information, she said aloud. I have. Well, then I guess all we can do is wait. The relief force from Santa Cruz dropped out of hyper in a single, perfectly coordinated transition, and tactical displays aboard the Navy Task Force warships began blinking alive with a rash of ominous red icons. Commodore Selkirk's entire combat strength consisted of one 4-ship battlecruiser division and one carrier, supported by 8 heavy cruisers, 9 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers. From the reports, Chartres' Near Space Command had managed to get out before subspace communication satellites were taken out. He already knew that even after the attackers' losses against Chartres' orbital defenses, which had not been insubstantial, he still faced 6 Melkonian battleships, 5 battlecruisers, 20 screening fists. Like the Melkonian ground unit of the same name, a naval fist consisted of 3 ships, a heavy cruiser supported by a light cruiser, and a destroyer. The comparative number of hulls, 34 human vessels opposed to 69 Melkonian ships, was bad enough. The tonnage differential was worse. Much worse. Despite that, Selkirk had certain offsetting advantages. One was that unlike deep space arrays which had given Chartres 2 full days warning of the Melkonians' arrival, even a battleship's detection range against a unit approaching through hyper was severely limited. The Melkonian CO had been given less than 4 hours warning before Selkirk's ship came piling at a hyper, and his combat strength was still at a position. Another advantage was that every one of Selkirk's ships possessed a fully self-aware AI, and those ships' command crews were neurally linked to them. They literally thought and fought at the same hyperheuristic speed as a Bolo. None of which changed the fact the battleship component of the enemy force alone outmassed his entire task force by more than 2 to 1. Orders flashed outward from Selkirk's flagship. He arranged his approach very carefully, and his task force and the accompanying transports deployed with smooth efficiency. The Commodore had deliberately dropped most of his warships back into normal space, well inside the 3 light-minute sphere of the Chartres jump point. That was precisely where the Melkonians had been expecting him, and although he managed to emerge into end space outside their immediate engagement range, but the transports, accompanied by the carrier Indomitable and 2 of his destroyers, made the transition to normal space out on the very rim of the jump point at its closest approach to the inner system. It had been a calculated risk, since it was always possible the Melkonian CO might have anticipated the maneuver and deployed it to smash the transports first, but it had paid off. The main body of the Melkonian fleet was exactly where Selkirk had hoped it would be, well out-system from the transport's emergence point, within the Commodore and his main combatants between it and the transports. The 8 transports, trailing their 3 escorts, arrowed straight toward the planet, while Selkirk and his brutally outnumbered force squared off to keep the Melkonians off their backs. Meneka felt physically sick to her stomach as her tactical plot showed the sea of hostile icons sweeping toward the Commodore and his handful of ships. She wasn't trained in Navy tactical iconography, but she didn't need to be to recognize the dreadful imbalance between the 2 forces. She didn't have a great deal of time to think about that, however. 4 Melkonian fists had apparently been providing orbital fire support for their ground forces. Now that the deep space defenses had been suppressed, and now they came peeling out of Chartres' planetary orbit as the transports steadied down their approach. Incoming missiles. Enemies targeting the transports, Benji announced. Stand by for anti-missile defense, Meneka replied, more as she was aware for something to say than Benji had needed instructions from her. Standing by. On each of the Sleipners, pairs of Bolos brought up their battle screens and activated their tracking systems, and waited with psychotronic calm as the Melkonian missiles shrieked toward them. And to her own immense surprise, Meneka Trevor felt her own pulse steady as she watched the arrowhead-shaped missile icons race to meet the Tannenberg. More icons blossomed on Benji's tactical plot, and Meneka recognized them as the Indomitable's outgoing fighters. There were 80 of them, and they were headed straight for the enormously larger Melkonian warships under maximum power. The missiles targeted onto the transports ignored them, and Meneka bared her teeth as she recognized the Melkonians' error. They should have tried to nail Indomitable before she launched, she thought, and they're about to find out that they had just wasted their entire initial salvo. Hypervelocity countermissiles were already spitting outward from the Bolos. Designed for planetary combat, they moved slowly compared to the deep space weapons charging to destroy the transports. But slowly was purely a relative term. They moved quickly enough when they were detected by the Bolos' targeting and computational systems, and groups of them relentlessly bracketed each incoming missile, boring into their offensive electronic countermeasures. And one by one, the Malkonian missiles were picked off far short of the attack range. Only 14 got through the counter-missile interception envelope, and 13 of those were picked off by infinite repeater fire far short of their targets. Only one got close enough to actually detonate against the battle screen protecting its intended victim, and that battle screen, reinforced by the full power of the Bolo on the opposite side of the transport hull, held. And while those missiles were attacking, the fighters from Indomitable flung themselves upon the Leviathan foes. 20 of them died before they got into engagement range. It would have been even worse, Meneka thought, sickened by the carnage, if the Malkonians had held back that initial missile launch, targeted on the fighters they ought to have known had been coming, but 25% losses before the surviving fighter pilots even crossed the missile envelope was quite bad enough. The 60 survivors ignored the destroyers shooting at them. Instead, they charged straight toward the cruisers. Close-in weapons opened up on them, but the fighters bored in grimly, holding their fire. The fleet's little vessels carried plasma torpedoes, triple-barreled, short-ranged weapons with an even heavier punch than Benji's Hellbore, but slow firing. The launchers took long enough to recharge that each fighter would only be able to fire a single salvo per firing pass. But the other energy weapons were intended for dogfighting against other fighters, too light to significantly damage something heavily armored as a warship, and the pilots were determined to make their single launch each count. Half of them died before they reached the range they sought and salvoed their torpedoes, but unlike missiles, plasma torpedoes were light-speed weapons. They ripped in, impossible to intercept, and all 4 of the heavy cruisers and 1 of the light cruisers disappeared in the hellish glare of impacting plasma. Each torpedo was the equivalent of a shaped-charged fusion warhead, slamming into its target with a megaton all of brimstone. And battle screens failed, and armor and hull plating vaporized as those man-made thunderbolts disemboweled their targets. One of the 3 surviving light cruisers was severely damaged, staggering sideways in a shower of shattered debris and the telltale shroud of venting atmosphere. Her emission signature was flickering uncertainly, and her drive field went down completely, but her consorts had been luckier. The fighter group targeted on one of them had taken murderous casualties on its way in. Only 2 of its pilots had survived a fire, and their launch signals had been badly desynchronized. The plasma torpedoes came in as separate, individual attacks, without the focus and precise timing which had killed its cruiser fellows, and the ship's battle screen managed to deflect most of their effectiveness. She was hurt, but not badly, and she continued to belch missiles at the transports. But the 4th light cruiser had clearly taken heavy damage. Her weapons fire ceased almost entirely, and her battle screen fluctuated wildly for a fraction of a second before it came back up to full strength and steadied. But there was nothing wrong with her drive, and she changed course abruptly. "Collision vector," Benji announced, and Meneka bit her lip as the cruiser's projected path intersected with Indomitable. The carrier's AI altered course, dodging hard, but her evasion options were too limited. The geometry was against her, and although her light shipboard weapons fired desperately, carriers weren't supposed to get this close to her main enemy combatants. They were supposed to operate under the cover and protection of an entire task force, providing a fighter umbrella to operate at ranges of up to several light hours away from her flight decks, or on independent operations at extreme range from anything but enemy fighters. And so they were equipped primarily with anti-fighter weapons, designed to provide volume of fire against swarms of attacking fighters, not to batter their way through a cruiser's battle screen. But Indomitable had no choice but to go meet the enemy this time, as she and her escorting destroyers fought to clear the way and keep the Malkonians away from the transports which had to reach the surface of Chartres. She was far too ahead of the Tannenberg and other transports for any of the Bolos to engage the cruiser before impact, and yet it was so agonizingly close. She was barely 100 kilometers outside of Benji's engagement range when the damaged cruiser slammed into her battle screens like a 250,000-ton hammer, and both ships vanished in a kinetic fireball brighter than the system's sun. Meneka swore bitterly as both icons disappeared from her plot, but even as she cursed, and even as she felt the horror in the deaths of almost 3,000 fellow human beings, she knew that at this moment, right here and now, Indomitable had been expendable. She and her massacred fighter group, of which only 11 survived, had done their job. Only one of the intercepting Melkonian cruisers remained, and a merciless corner of Meneka's mind wondered if the crew of that ship truly realized what was about to happen to it. The cruiser and all 4 enemy destroyers bored in, and the Concordiat's destroyers went to meet them. They were faster than the Melkonians, more maneuverable, and they fought with a deadly efficiency. But there were only 2 of them, and if their human AI fusions used their weapons far more effectively, they were outgunned by over 5 to 1. It was a short, vicious engagement, a knife-range battle which stripped away much of the combat advantage human ships' superior coordination and defensive systems normally conferred, because it had to be. The destroyer crews knew they had to clear the transport's path before any additional Melkonian units managed to break past the Commodore's Selkirk or suddenly appeared unexpectedly from the far side of the planet, and so they took the Melkonians on at the enemy's most effective range. They died, but they took 3 of the 4 intercepting destroyers with them, and the 4th was so badly damaged that it reeled out of the engagement with its battle screen entirely down. The light cruiser burst through the engagement, streaming atmosphere but with its energy weapons intact, and all her surviving batteries opened fire on the CNS Tannenberg, which happened to be the lead transport. Meneka felt her face locking in a snarl of triumph as the cruiser spat death at her. The battle screen which now protected the transport was a Bolo battle screen, designed to deflect the fire of Benji's own main armament at anything beyond point-blank range, and it sneered the lesser energy weapons mounted on a mere light cruiser. Benji's battle screen brushed the long-range fire aside almost contemptuously. Then his main turret traversed slightly and fired once. When the Mark 28 Bolo had first been introduced, its main armament had been the equivalent of that mounted in a Concordiat Navy current generation ship of the line. Technology had moved on since then, into newer, deadlier, more powerful weaponry, but even today, nothing lighter than a battle cruiser, and precious few of them mounted anything approaching the lethality of his 110cm Hellbore, and certainly no light cruiser did, and none of them had been designed to survive its fury. Benji's target shattered, blowing apart and then abruptly vaporizing as the ship's antimatter power plant's containment fields went down. The fierce, blinding flash of the fireball polarized Benji's direct visual display, and Meneka heard her own soprano shriek of triumph as the cruiser disappeared. The remaining crippled cruiser and destroyer died almost as spectacularly seconds later under the vengeful of the other Bolos, and then the transports were clear, racing toward the planet they had come to save or die trying. Despite its population, which was certainly of respectable size for any world outside of the core sectors, the planet of Chartres had been touched relatively lightly by the imprint of mankind. All of its developed, terraformed cropland was concentrated on only one of its 3 major landmasses, along with virtually all of its citizens, 2/3 of whom lived in a relatively small number of large urban centers surrounded by rolling farmland or virgin forest. But Chartres was lightly touched no longer. Benji's assault pod separated from Tannenberg and dived roaringly into the planetary atmosphere, and his infinite repeaters fired steadily as he and the rest of the battalion systematically eliminated every piece of orbital debris that didn't carry a Concordiat IFF code. Melkonian stealth systems were good, but they weren't perfect, and the battalion's relentless assault burned away the reconnaissance platforms the invaders had deployed. Meneka studied the visual images from Benji's optical heads as the assault wave howled downward. La Roche City, the planetary capital, with its population of over 30 million, was a smoking, blazing sea of ruins. Provence and Nouveau Dijon were little better, although at least the rim of Nouveau Dijon's suburbs appeared to have survived partially intact, and the same was true for at least 24 of the planet's other cities and larger towns. The green and brown patchwork of farms and the dark green of woodlands surrounding what had once been the habitations of man were dotted with the wreckage of missiles and air-breathing attack craft, which had been destroyed by the ruined city's perimeter defenses, and the towering pillars of smoke and dust seemed to be everywhere. Although Chartres' population had been tiny compared to one of the core worlds like Old Earth, it had been large enough, and the star system's industrial base had been extensive enough to provide quite heavy ground-based defensive systems. The local planetary and system authorities, with the assistance of the Concordia central government, had taken advantage of that and spent most of the past 6 standard years fortifying and preparing against the probability of an eventual Melkonian attack. But with the line grinding back only slowly across the Camperdown sector, the planning authorities had given higher priority to systems and planners under more immediate threat. No one had anticipated that the Empire would show the daring to strike this deeply into a major star system inside the Concordiat's frontier. And the local defenses, however formidable, had not been formidable enough. Someone should have seen it coming, she thought grimly. Sure, they had to send in the equivalent of an entire fleet to pull it off, but the tempo of this war has done nothing but accelerate from the very beginning, and both sides are getting more desperate as the casualty totals go up. We should have realized that sooner or later, the puppies will roll the dice like this. If they can pull it off, establish a sizable fleet presence this far into our rear, at the very least it would force us into a major redeployment until we could deal with it. That was probably worth risking the loss of the entire force all by itself, and that doesn't even count taking out Chartres' population and industrial base. But at least the system's defenders had given enough warning to execute their evacuation plans. Meneka had no way of knowing, and did not want to know, how many of the citizens of those butchered cities had failed to get out in time. But the glowing green icons of scores of huge refugee centers, all of them with at least rudimentary previously prepared defenses, burned in Benji's strategic plot. In addition to the fixed defenses, most of them were ringed by the additional icons of planetary militia and the remnants of the detachments of regulars deployed to the planet. And those defenses appeared to be holding against the aerial bombardment raining down upon them, now that the fleet units which had been providing the Melkonian attackers with fire support from orbit had been dispersed. But there was no way any of them could have hoped to hold more than briefly against the terrifying concentration of ground-based firepower the Melkonians had managed to land on the planetary surface before the Concordiat relief force arrived.